In the harsh winter of 1840, deep within the untamed forests of the Arizona Territory, a young Apache warrior named Takoda finds himself fleeing from a massacre that destroyed his village. Wounded, starving, and pursued by those who killed his family, he stumbles into a forbidden valley that his people have feared for generations, the Valley of Shadows, home to the legendary forest giant they call Chiye-tanka, the Bigfoot. When Takoda collapses from exhaustion near a frozen stream, he awakens to find himself face to face with the massive creature, standing over 12 feet tall with eyes that hold an ancient sadness. In a moment of desperation, as the giant reaches toward him with hands large enough to crush his skull, Takoda makes an impossible offer that will change both their lives forever. What begins as a desperate bargain for survival becomes an extraordinary bond between two outcasts, one running from the violence of men, the other hiding from a loneliness so profound it has turned him into legend. But when Takoda's past catches up with him, and the men who destroyed his village track him to the valley, both the Apache and the giant must decide what they're willing to sacrifice for the only friendship either has ever known. This is a story about finding family in the most unexpected places, about the bridges we build between broken souls, and about a promise made in fear that becomes the foundation for the most profound love, a love that will demand the ultimate price. The blood on Takoda's buckskin shirt had frozen into a dark crimson stain that cracked with each labored breath he took. And if you had told him 3 days ago that he would die alone in these mountains, he would have laughed, because Takoda of the Chiricahua Apache had never been alone in his entire 30 years of life. But that was before the soldiers came, before the screaming, before he watched his wife Ayana fall with their unborn child still in her belly, before the world became nothing but running and bleeding and the desperate animal need to survive just one more hour. The snow fell heavy now, thick flakes that should have been beautiful but felt like cold accusations against his skin, reminding him that he had run while others died, that he had chosen his own life over standing with his brothers. And the shame of it burned hotter than the bullet wound in his side that he knew was going bad, because he could smell the infection even through the freeze. His fingers had gone numb 2 hours past, maybe 3. Time had become elastic and strange, and when his moccasin caught on a hidden root and sent him sprawling face first into a snowdrift, Takoda lay there for a long moment, wondering if this was how it ended. If the spirits would forgive him for dying like a wounded animal instead of a warrior, if Ayana waited for him in the next world, or if she had turned her face away in disgust. But something made him push up, some stubborn core of survival that refused to let the cold take him. And that's when he saw it through the trees, a valley that shouldn't exist, a place where the snow seemed lighter and the air felt different, warmer somehow. And he remembered old grandfather Nantai's stories about the Forbidden Valley, the place where the Chiye-tanka lived, the forest giant with fur like a bear and eyes like a man who had learned to hate all living things. The tribe had forbidden anyone from entering for as long as the stories went back. And those few hunters who had stumbled into the valley by accident spoke of shadows that moved like mountains, of howls that made your bones vibrate with primal terror, of the sense that something massive and intelligent watched from just beyond sight. And every instinct Takoda possessed screamed at him to turn back, to die anywhere but here. Yet what did he have to lose now? His family was gone, his village was ash and bones, and the soldiers would find his body whether he died here or a mile north. So he stumbled forward into the valley, each step an agony, each breath a battle. And the trees seemed to lean in closer, as if curious about this broken man, invading their ancient silence. The valley opened before him like a secret, and despite everything, despite the pain and grief and exhaustion, Takoda felt his breath catch because it was beautiful in a way that made his heart ache. With towering pines that must have been growing since before the first Apache walked these lands, with a stream that somehow ran liquid and clear despite the winter cold, And everywhere there was this sense of something watching, waiting, judging. He made it perhaps 20 more steps before his legs simply gave out. And this time when he fell, he knew he wouldn't rise again. So he dragged himself to a massive boulder near the stream and propped his back against it. His rifle clutched uselessly in hands that could barely feel the wood anymore, and he thought about Ayana's smile, about the way she used to braid eagle feathers into her hair, about the child he would never meet, and the tears that came froze on his cheeks before they could fall. That's when he heard it, a sound like breathing, but impossibly deep, impossibly large. The kind of breath that moved air the way wind moves through canyons, and every hair on Takoda's body stood rigid because he knew that sound, had heard it described around campfires in hushed voices, had dismissed it as legend, until this exact moment when legend stepped out from behind a cluster of ancient pines and became devastatingly, terrifyingly real. The Chiye-tanka stood at least 12 feet tall, maybe more, with shoulders broader than two men standing side by side, covered in dark brown fur that was matted with ice and debris. And its face, sweet spirits, its face was almost human, with deep-set eyes that caught the fading light and reflected it back with an intelligence that froze Takoda's blood more thoroughly than any winter could. They stared at each other across 30 feet of snow, predator and prey, legend and man. And Takoda's hand moved without conscious thought to raise his rifle, even though he knew the gesture was pointless, even though a bullet would only anger this creature, even though he was already dead, and this was just the final act. The giant moved forward with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive, each footfall making almost no sound, despite leaving prints in the snow deep enough to bury Takoda's entire leg, and it cocked its head in a gesture so human, so curious, that for a heartbeat Takoda forgot to be terrified and instead felt a strange recognition pass between them. Two beings alone in the wilderness, two survivors, two souls that carried the weight of things unspeakable. "Please don't kill me," Takoda heard himself say in Apache, his voice cracking, the words spilling out before he could stop them. And he hated himself for begging, for breaking, for proving that when death finally came for him, he would meet it not as a warrior, but as a frightened man. The giant paused at the words, and though it couldn't possibly understand Apache, something in its eyes shifted, some ancient sadness surfacing like a drowned thing rising to break the surface. And it made a sound, low and mournful, like wind through a cave, like grief made audible. Then it moved again, faster now, and Takoda's finger tightened on the trigger, even as his vision began to tunnel and darken, because the blood loss was finally taking him, and at least he wouldn't be conscious when those massive hands tore him apart. But instead of violence, the giant simply knelt beside him, so close that Takoda could smell it, earth, and pine, and something wild and clean, and it reached out one enormous hand toward his wounded side with such careful deliberation that Takoda found himself holding his breath. The touch when it came was surprisingly gentle, almost tender, and the giant's fingers probed the bullet wound with a delicacy that seemed impossible from something so large. And Takoda gasped at the pain, but also at the absurdity of this moment, at the fact that he was being examined by a creature that shouldn't exist. And when the giant pulled its hand back and looked at the blood on its fingers, Takoda saw something in those deep eyes that looked almost like concern. "I'll build you a cabin," Takoda said, the words tumbling out in a delirium-fueled rush because his mind was fracturing and nothing made sense anymore. But somehow this felt important. This felt like the right thing to say. "If you let me live, if you help me, I'll build you a cabin, a home, something better than hiding in caves and shadows. I'm a good builder, my father taught me. I can work with wood and stone, and maybe you're tired of being alone out here. Maybe you want something more than this endless cold." The giant stared at him, and Takoda couldn't tell if it understood or if he was simply hallucinating this entire encounter. If he was already dead, and this was some fever dream his dying brain had constructed, but then the creature did something that changed everything. It nodded, one slow, deliberate movement of that massive head, and then it scooped Takoda up in its arms as easily as a father lifting a child. And the last thing Takoda remembered before darkness claimed him was the sound of that mournful howl echoing through the valley. A sound that might have been agreement, or might have been a question, or might have been simply the loneliest sound he had ever heard. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, warmth first. Blessed warmth that felt like a miracle against skin that had been frozen for so long. Then the smell of wood smoke and something cooking. Then pain as sensation returned to his extremities in waves of pins and needles. And finally sight as his eyes fluttered open to find himself in a cave lit by a large fire, wrapped in furs that smelled of the forest, with his wound cleaned and packed with some kind of moss and herbs that he didn't recognize. The giant sat across the fire from him, watching with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. And in the firelight, Takoda could see details he had missed before. The silver streaks in the dark fur around the creature's face, the scars that crisscrossed its massive arms, the way its hands moved with surprising dexterity as they turned a rabbit on a crude spit, and most striking of all, the profound sadness that seemed to emanate from it like heat from the flames. "You saved me," Takoda whispered in Apache, his throat raw, and again the giant tilted its head in that almost human gesture of acknowledgement. Why? But of course there was no answer, just that steady gaze and the crackling of the fire. And Takoda realized that he had stumbled into something far stranger than legend, into a story that had no name yet, into a bond that defied every understanding he had of the world. The giant reached across and placed the cooked rabbit within Takoda's reach, and in that simple gesture of sharing food, of care, something fundamental shifted in the Apache warrior's understanding of what it meant to be alone and what it might mean to be found. Takoda spent the first 3 days drifting in and out of fever dreams where Ayana's face merged with the giant's sad eyes and the screams from his burning village echoed off cave walls that seemed to breathe with their own rhythm. And each time he surfaced to consciousness, he found the Chiye-tanka there, changing the moss poultices on his wound with those surprisingly gentle hands, offering him water from a hollowed gourd, or simply sitting in the shadows watching him with an expression that Takoda was beginning to recognize as concern. On the 4th morning, he woke with a clarity he hadn't felt since before the massacre. The fever broken at last, and he managed to sit up without the world spinning into darkness, which felt like a victory worth celebrating, except that victories seemed hollow now when there was no one left to share them with. The giant was gone when consciousness fully returned, but the fire had been built up, and there was fresh meat on a flat stone near the flames, and Takoda ate slowly, methodically, feeling strength return to his body even as his spirit remained fractured and raw. He used the solitude to explore the cave with shuffling steps, one hand pressed against the stone wall for support, and what he found astonished him because this wasn't just a shelter. It was a home of sorts, organized in ways that spoke of intelligence and intention, with sleeping areas lined with carefully arranged furs, with stores of dried meat and roots tucked into natural alcoves, with tools fashioned from stone and bone, arranged with a precision that reminded Takoda of his own workshop back in the village that no longer existed. In the deepest part of the cave, partially hidden behind a rock formation, he found something that made his throat tighten, drawings on the wall, crude but unmistakable, showing what looked like other giants, smaller ones that might have been children, and a female figure that the artist had returned to again and again, her image overlapping itself as if the drawer couldn't bear to stop recreating her. The images had been made with charcoal and what looked like ochre, and some were so faded they must have been ancient, while others looked fresh. And Takoda understood then with a clarity that pierced him like an arrow that the Chiye-tanka wasn't just alone. He was the last, the only one left. drawing and redrawing memories of a family that existed now only in charcoal and grief. "You lost them too," Takoda said to the empty cave, his voice echoing off stone, and he pressed his palm against the drawing of the female giant, feeling the rough texture of the wall, the dried pigment, and something in his chest cracked open because he had thought his pain was unique, had thought no one could understand the particular flavor of his loss. But here in these primitive, beautiful, terrible drawings was a grief that matched his own. When the giant returned an hour later, dragging a small deer that would feed them for days, Takoda was still standing before the wall of memories, and the creature froze in the cave entrance, its massive body going rigid. And for the first time, Takoda saw something like fear in those ancient eyes, not fear of violence, but fear of judgment. Fear of having the most private part of itself exposed to scrutiny. "They were beautiful," Takoda said softly, still in Apache, but letting his tone carry the meaning his words could not. And he touched the drawing of what must have been the giant's mate with reverence, with respect, with the understanding of one who had also loved and lost. The tension in the Chiye-tanka's posture eased slightly, and it made that low, mournful sound again. But this time, Takoda thought he heard a question in it, something that might have meant, "You understand," or might have meant, "Does it ever stop hurting?" And he shook his head slowly because no, it didn't stop. The pain just became something you carried, became part of the architecture of who you were. The giant moved into the cave and began to prepare the deer with practiced efficiency, and Takoda watched those massive hands work, seeing now what he had missed before, the care, the loneliness, the desire for connection that had been buried under layers of isolation so thick they had become legend. That night, they sat across the fire from each other, as had become their ritual. But this time, Takoda began to speak, letting words flow in Apache, knowing the giant couldn't understand them, but needing to give voice to the things that festered inside him. He told the story of the massacre, described the soldiers who had come at dawn with torches and rifles, explained how he had been out checking trap lines when he heard the screams, how he had run back to find his village already burning, how he had searched through smoke and chaos for Ayana and found her in their dwelling, her hand pressed to her swollen belly, her eyes already glazing with death, and how her last word had been his name spoken like a question, like she was asking why he hadn't been there to protect her. The giant listened without moving, its eyes reflecting firelight, and Takoda talked about the guilt that was worse than the grief, about how he had grabbed his rifle and run instead of dying with honor, about how he was a coward who deserved to freeze in these mountains. And as he spoke, the words poured out faster and faster until he was sobbing, his whole body shaking with the force of it, and he didn't notice the giant moving, until those massive arms wrapped around him with impossible gentleness and held him while he broke apart. The embrace should have been terrifying. Those arms could crush him without effort. Those hands could snap his spine like a dry twig, but instead it felt like safety, like being held by something older and wiser than human understanding. And Takoda pressed his face against the giant's chest and wept until there was nothing left inside him but emptiness and exhaustion. When he finally pulled back, wiping at his face with shaking hands, the Chiye-tanka made a series of soft grunting sounds and gestured toward the wall of drawings, then to its own chest, then back to Takoda, and even without shared language the meaning was clear. "I know. I understand. I too have lost everything." They sat together in the firelight, two souls united by grief, and Takoda felt something shift in his perception, because the giant wasn't a monster to be feared, wasn't even really the Chiye-tanka of legend anymore. He was just another broken creature trying to survive in a world that had taken everything that mattered. "I need to call you something," Takoda said, his voice raw from crying. A name, not just giant or Chiye-tanka. He thought for a moment, looking at those sad, intelligent eyes, at the silver in the dark fur, at the careful way this massive being moved through the world. And a name came to him from the old stories, from before the Apache had come to these lands, from the ancient peoples who had first walked these mountains. Nashoba, he said, trying out the sound. It means wolf in the old tongue. And wolves are loyal, fierce, protective of their pack. And they too know what it means to lose. The giant cocked its head, and Takoda repeated the name, pointing to the creature's chest. Nashoba, that's who you are. And though it couldn't possibly understand the word's meaning, the giant touched its own chest and made a sound that might have been an attempt to echo the name. And Takoda smiled for the first time since the world had ended. A small, fragile thing that hurt his face, but felt like the first flower pushing through snow. Over the following days, a routine established itself that felt almost normal if you ignored the fundamental strangeness of a man and a giant sharing a cave-like family. Takoda's wound healed with remarkable speed, thanks to whatever herbs Nashoba had packed it with. And as strength returned, he began to help with daily tasks, gathering firewood with Nashoba, watching protectively nearby, helping to prepare the meat the giant brought back from hunts, even attempting to improve their living space by arranging stones to create better areas for different activities. Nashoba proved to be an attentive companion, watching everything Takoda did with intense focus, as if trying to memorize not just the actions, but the reasoning behind them. And gradually they developed a language of gestures and sounds that allowed basic communication. A low grunt meant, "Danger!" A huffing sound meant, "Follow me." A gentle touch to the shoulder meant, "Are you well?" It wasn't sophisticated, but it worked, and Takoda found himself talking constantly in Apache just to fill the silence, telling Nashoba about his life before, about Apache customs and beliefs, about his father, who had been a master craftsman and had taught Takoda to see the potential in wood and stone. "I made you a promise," Takoda said one evening as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside the cave in a storm that would have killed him if he'd still been wandering the mountains alone. "I said I would build you a cabin, a real home, and I mean to keep that promise." Nashoba tilted his massive head, and Takoda gestured expansively, trying to communicate the concept. "A structure with walls and a roof, warmer than this cave, something that's yours, that you built, well, that we built together." He picked up a piece of charcoal from the fire's edge and began to draw on a flat section of cave wall, sketching out a simple but sturdy cabin design, the kind his father had taught him to construct, showing how logs could be notched and fitted together, how a roof could be pitched to shed snow, how a stone chimney could be built to draw smoke properly. The giant watched with fascination, leaning in close, and when Takoda finished the rough sketch, Nashoba reached out and touched the drawing with one huge finger, tracing the lines, and made a questioning sound. "Yes," Takoda said, understanding instinctively. "For you, for us, a home we build together, something permanent, something that says you're not just hiding anymore, that you exist, that you matter." And maybe it was the firelight playing tricks, or maybe it was real, but Takoda could have sworn he saw moisture in those deep-set eyes, as if the concept of having a home again, of building something instead of just surviving, had touched something in the giant's ancient heart. Nashoba made a decisive sound and stood, moving to the cave entrance despite the storm, and gestured for Takoda to follow. And when they stood together at the threshold, looking out at the snow-covered valley, the giant pointed to a spot near the stream, where the trees formed a natural clearing, then looked down at Takoda and made that sound that meant agreement, that meant, "Yes, there, we will build it there." Planning the cabin became an obsession that pulled Takoda back from the edge of despair, because it gave him purpose beyond mere survival, gave him something to build instead of something to mourn. And he spent hours sketching designs in the dirt, explaining to Nashoba through gestures and demonstrations how they would need to fell trees of specific sizes, how the logs would need to be stripped and seasoned, how the foundation would need to be laid with stones from the stream to keep the wood from rotting. Nashoba proved to be an incredibly fast learner, watching Takoda's demonstrations with total focus, and then replicating the actions with surprising precision, despite the difference in their size and strength. And Takoda realized that the giant's isolation hadn't been by choice. He had the intelligence and desire for community, but had been forced into solitude by fear, by being the last of his kind, by knowing that humans would only see him as a monster to be killed. You know what the cruelest part is? Takoda said one night, lying on his bed of furs and staring at the cave ceiling, while Neshoba sat nearby, working on sharpening a stone tool. They destroyed my village because they feared us, because we were different, because they couldn't see us as human, just as obstacles to be removed. And my people feared you for the same reason, called you monster, told stories to frighten children, never considered that you might be as lonely and scared as anyone else. We're all just afraid of what we don't understand, and that fear makes us cruel. Neshoba looked up from his work and made a soft sound, and even without words, Takoda felt the giant's agreement, felt the weight of centuries of isolation and fear, and he made a decision then that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "When we build this cabin," he said, sitting up to look directly at Neshoba, "it's not just going to be yours, it's going to be ours, a home for both of us. Because I have nowhere else to go, and you saved my life, and honestly, I can't imagine leaving you here alone anymore. Would that be acceptable to you?" The silence that followed felt enormous, and Takoda worried he had presumed too much, had pushed too far too fast. But then Neshoba set down the stone tool and moved across the cave with that surprising grace. And he sat down directly in front of Takoda, so close their knees almost touched. And he reached out with one massive hand and placed it very gently on top of Takoda's head, in a gesture that felt like blessing, like acceptance, like family. No words were needed. The answer was in the touch, in the way Neshoba's other hand came up to rest over his own heart, in the low sound he made that Takoda had learned meant contentment. And Takoda felt tears sting his eyes again, but these were different tears, not grief, but something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The first tree they felled together took an entire day and nearly ended in disaster. When Takoda misjudged the angle of the cut, and the massive pine started to fall toward him instead of away. But Neshoba moved with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, and caught the trunk mid-fall, his muscles bunching beneath the fur as he redirected its momentum with a roar that shook snow from the surrounding branches. And afterward, Takoda sat in the snow trembling, while the giant checked him over with frantic huffing sounds that clearly meant, "Are you hurt? You foolish small creature, you nearly died." They developed a better system after that, with Takoda marking the trees and planning the cuts, while Neshoba provided the raw strength needed to bring them down safely. And together they worked through the short winter days with a rhythm that felt ancient and right, like this was how it had always been meant to be, two beings building something together, creating instead of destroying. The work was brutal and exhausting, and exactly what Takoda needed, because it left no room for the memories that lurked at the edges of his mind. Waiting for quiet moments to strike, and he threw himself into it with desperate intensity, teaching Neshoba how to strip bark using sharp stones, how to notch the logs so they would fit together like puzzle pieces, how to judge the straightness of a timber by sighting down its length. The giant learned with remarkable speed, his intelligence becoming more apparent with each passing day. And Takoda found himself wondering what Neshoba might have become if he'd been raised among others of his kind, if he'd had teachers and community instead of just survival and solitude. Sometimes in the evenings when they returned to the cave exhausted and covered in pine sap, Takoda would find Neshoba staring at his own hands as if seeing them differently now, as if recognizing them not just as tools for survival, but as instruments capable of creation. And there was something heartbreaking about watching this ancient being discover purpose after what must have been decades, or even centuries, of merely existing. 3 weeks into the project, On a day when the sun actually broke through the clouds and made the snow-covered valley sparkle like it was covered in diamonds. They finished laying the foundation stones and stepped back to admire their work. And Takoda felt a pride swell in his chest that he hadn't experienced since before the world ended. "We're really doing this," he said, partly to Neshoba and partly to himself, to the memory of his father who had taught him these skills, to Ayana, who he hoped somehow could see that he hadn't given up completely, that he was still trying to build something beautiful, even in the ruins of everything. Neshoba made a sound that Takoda had come to recognize as the giant's version of pleasure, a deep rumbling purr that vibrated in his chest. And then did something unexpected. He reached down and very carefully picked up Takoda, lifting him high onto his shoulders so the Apache warrior could see the foundation from the giant's perspective, from a height where the valley spread out below them like a promised land. And Takoda laughed, actually laughed for the first time since the massacre, the sound startling birds from nearby trees. But the outside world has a way of intruding on even the most carefully constructed isolation, and it came for them on a morning when frost covered everything in white lace, and Takoda was teaching Neshoba how to mix mud and moss for chinking between the logs. The giant froze mid-movement, his massive head swiveling toward the valley entrance, and he made a sound Takoda had never heard before, low and dangerous. Almost a growl, the sound of a predator recognizing a threat. "What is it?" Takoda asked, reaching instinctively for the rifle he now kept nearby, and Neshoba pointed toward the tree line with one huge hand, while making a series of urgent grunts that clearly meant danger. "Humans, hide." Takoda's blood went cold because there was only one reason humans would be this deep in the mountains in winter. Only one thing they could be tracking, and that was him. The soldiers had found his trail somehow, had followed him into the Forbidden Valley, and they would bring death with them, just as they had brought it to his village. "You need to hide," Takoda said urgently, grabbing Neshoba's arm, trying to pull the giant toward the deeper forest, even though it was like trying to move a mountain. "If they see you, they'll hunt you. They'll bring more men. They'll never stop until you're dead. Please, Neshoba, you have to go." But the giant refused to budge, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line, and he made a sound that was unmistakably negative. That clearly meant, "No, I will not leave you to face them alone." And Takoda felt his heart break a little because this creature who had every reason to hate humans was willing to risk himself for one broken Apache warrior who had stumbled into his life by accident. The sound of horses carried across the snow, and voices, rough male voices speaking English, the language of the soldiers who had destroyed everything Takoda loved, and he had perhaps 5 minutes before they would crest the ridge and see the valley, see the partially built cabin, see him. "Listen to me," Takoda said with fierce urgency, switching to the gesture language they had developed, making the signs for "trust me. Please, I will talk to them, I will lead them away. But you cannot be seen, not for your sake, but because I cannot watch another thing I care about die. Do you understand?" Something in his expression or his gestures must have conveyed the depth of his feeling, because Neshoba's aggressive posture softened slightly, and he reached out to cup Takoda's face with one enormous hand, a gesture they had never shared before, so gentle and careful that Takoda had to blink back tears. The giant made a soft, questioning sound, and Takoda nodded. "I'll be careful, I promise. But please, go back to the cave, stay hidden, and if I don't return by nightfall, you need to leave this valley and never come back. Find somewhere safer. Somewhere they'll never find you." Neshoba made a sound that was clearly protest. But the horses were getting closer, and there was no more time for argument. So Takoda pushed at the giant's chest with both hands, putting all his desperation into the gesture. And finally, reluctantly, Neshoba began to move back toward the tree line, melting into the shadows with a silence that seemed impossible for something so massive. But not before turning back one last time to lock eyes with Takoda in a look that conveyed more than words ever could. "Stay safe," Small friend, because I have lost everyone else, and I cannot lose you too." Then he was gone, vanished into the forest like smoke, and Takoda was alone, standing beside the half-built cabin when the first soldier crested the ridge. And the man's eyes went wide with surprise, because clearly he hadn't expected to find anyone here, much less a living Apache in the middle of nowhere. There were 4 of them, all mounted, all armed with rifles that they immediately trained on Takoda as they rode down into the valley. And he recognized the leader, Lieutenant Morrison, a man who had been present at the massacre, who had smiled while Takoda's world burned, who now sat his horse with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for the violence he dealt out. "Well, well," Morrison said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false friendliness that Takoda had learned to associate with men who enjoyed hurting others. "Look what we have here, boys, a survivor. We thought we got all you savages, but it seems one rat slipped through the cracks." The other soldiers laughed, and Takoda forced himself to remain still, to keep his hands visible, to give them no excuse to shoot him down where he stood, even though every instinct screamed at him to grab his rifle and take as many of them with him as he could. "This is neutral territory," Takoda said in careful English, the language he had learned from traders, keeping his voice level despite the rage boiling in his chest. "The treaty your government signed says the Apache have right of passage through these mountains." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Treaties are for when we need something from you people, and right now we don't need a damn thing except for you to be dead and your land to be ours. Besides, you're wanted for murder. You and your savage friends killed 3 settlers last month, and I'm here to bring you to justice." It was a lie, a transparent fabrication, and they both knew it. But lies were useful when you wanted justification for what you were planning to do anyway. And Takoda saw his death in Morrison's eyes, saw that these men had no intention of taking him anywhere except to a shallow grave. "I've been in this valley for over a month," Takoda said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I couldn't have killed anyone. I've been building a cabin, trying to survive the winter." He gestured to the structure behind him, and one of the other soldiers, a younger man who didn't look entirely comfortable with what was happening, actually looked at it with something like curiosity. "That's fine work," the young soldier said. "Must have taken weeks to get this far." Morrison shot him a glare that could have melted steel. "Doesn't matter what he's been doing, an Apache is an Apache, and the only good one is a dead one. We're doing the territory a favor by putting this animal down." He raised his rifle, and Takoda saw his finger start to tighten on the trigger, and time seemed to slow to a crawl as Takoda realized this was it. This was the end. He would die here without even having finished the cabin, without saying goodbye to Neshoba, without ever knowing if the pain would have eventually faded to something bearable. The roar that split the air was like nothing Takoda had ever heard, like a mountain giving voice to its rage, and Neshoba exploded from the tree line, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move, covering the ground between the forest and the soldiers in heartbeats, and the horses screamed in terror and reared, throwing 2 of the riders while the others fought to control their mounts. Morrison's shot went wild, the bullet burying itself in a tree trunk, and then Neshoba was among them, and he backhanded one soldier's horse so hard the animal went sprawling, tossing its rider into the snow. And the giant's fury was a physical thing, a force of nature unleashed. But Takoda saw something crucial that the soldiers missed in their panic. Neshoba wasn't trying to kill them. He was just trying to scatter them, trying to create enough chaos to make them flee. And even in his protective rage, the giant was pulling his strikes, using a fraction of the strength that could have torn men apart like wet paper. "Neshoba, no!" Takoda shouted, running toward the melee even though it was suicide, even though he was just as likely to be trampled or shot as the soldiers. But he couldn't let this happen, couldn't let Neshoba throw away his hidden existence to save one human who probably wasn't worth saving. Morrison had regained control of his horse and was bringing his rifle to bear on the giant's chest. And Takoda didn't think, just acted, throwing himself at Morrison's leg and dragging the man from his saddle just as the rifle fired. The bullet meant for Neshoba's heart, instead grazing the giant's shoulder and sending him stumbling back with a bellow of pain and surprise. They hit the ground hard, Takoda and Morrison tangled together, and the lieutenant's fist caught Takoda in the jaw with enough force to make stars explode across his vision. But Takoda had learned to fight from Apache warriors who believed that honor in combat mattered less than survival. So he got his thumb into Morrison's eye and pressed until the man screamed and released him. Retreat. The young soldier was shouting, already galloping toward the valley entrance, and the other two soldiers who could still control their horses followed him without hesitation, because when faced with a 12-foot-tall monster that could backhand a horse into submission, retreat was the only sane option. Morrison scrambled to his feet, blood streaming from his eye, his face twisted with rage and pain, and he scooped up his rifle from where it had fallen. But instead of pointing it at Neshoba, he aimed it at Takoda, and his smile was a terrible thing to see. "I'm going to kill your pet monster," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "But first I'm going to make you watch him die. And then I'm going to make his death last for hours. And then, when he's begging for mercy in whatever savage language monsters speak, I'm going to kill you too." His finger tightened on the trigger, and Takoda closed his eyes, waiting for the impact. But it never came. The sound of Morrison's neck breaking was surprisingly quiet, almost delicate, like a green branch snapping underfoot. And when Takoda opened his eyes, he saw Neshoba holding the lieutenant suspended in one massive hand, the man's feet dangling 2 feet off the ground, his rifle fallen uselessly into the snow. And the giant's face was terrible to behold, because all the gentleness had been stripped away, leaving only ancient protective fury, the kind of rage that came from watching everything you loved be destroyed and refusing to let it happen again. Morrison's remaining good eye was wide with terror, and his mouth worked soundlessly as Neshoba's grip tightened incrementally. And Takoda saw the exact moment when the soldier understood he was going to die, saw the fear replace the arrogance, saw the humanity emerge too late to save him. And part of Takoda, the part that had watched Ayana die, that had seen children burned alive, that carried rage like a second heartbeat, wanted to let it happen, wanted to watch Morrison pay for every Apache life he had taken with such casual cruelty. "Neshoba, stop," Takoda said, his voice hoarse. And the giant's eyes flickered to him, still blazing with protective anger. And there was a question in that gaze. This human hurt you, tried to kill you. Why should he live? Morrison's face was turning purple now, his struggles becoming weaker, and Takoda forced himself to stand, despite the pain radiating from his jaw where Morrison's fist had connected. Forced himself to walk closer to Neshoba, even though the giant in this state was more dangerous than any force of nature. "If you kill him, you become the monster they always said you were," Takoda said softly, reaching up to touch Neshoba's arm, feeling the tremors of restrained violence running through those massive muscles. "If you kill him, they'll hunt you forever. We'll bring armies into this valley, and they won't stop until you're dead and this place is destroyed. Please, my friend, please let him go." The silence stretched out like pulled taffy, broken only by Morrison's desperate, gasping attempts to breathe. And Takoda could see the war happening behind Neshoba's eyes, could see centuries of isolation and pain and fear battling against the fragile connection they had built over these past weeks. And he held his breath because he didn't know which side would win. Didn't know if the giant he had come to care for could pull back from this edge, or if the monster the legends spoke of would emerge fully formed and justified. Then with a sound that might have been anguish, or might have been surrender, Neshoba opened his hand and let Morrison drop to the snow like a discarded toy. And the lieutenant immediately scrambled backward on hands and knees, coughing and wheezing, his damaged eyes streaming tears, his arrogance completely shattered by proximity to his own mortality. "Run," Takoda said to Morrison in English, his voice flat and cold. Run and tell your commanders that the Apache in the Forbidden Valley is dead, that you saw his body frozen in the snow, that there's nothing here worth coming back for. Tell them you were chased away by a bear, by wolves, by anything except the truth. Because if you tell the truth about what you saw here today, I promise you that what just happened will seem like mercy. Morrison stared at him with his one good eye, and Takoda could see the calculation happening, could see the man weighing his options, could see the moment when survival instinct overrode pride and the desire for revenge. "This isn't over," Morrison rasped, his voice damaged from Neshoba's grip. "I'll be back, with more men, with enough firepower to bring down whatever devil you've got protecting you." But even as he said it, he was backing away toward where his horse had bolted. And when he finally turned and ran, stumbling through the snow toward the valley entrance, he looked nothing like the confident soldier who had ridden in planning murder. Takoda watched until Morrison disappeared over the ridge, and only then did he allow himself to collapse into the snow, the adrenaline that had been holding him upright draining away and leaving him shaking and weak. And he pressed his face into his hands and tried to remember how to breathe normally, tried to process what had just happened, tried to understand that they were alive, but that everything had just changed irrevocably. He felt Neshoba kneel beside him, felt that gentle touch on his shoulder, and when he looked up, the giant's face had returned to its normal expression of melancholy concern. The rage burned away, leaving only worry. And Neshoba made a questioning sound, while his hands moved over Takoda, checking for injuries with a delicacy that seemed impossible from something that had just nearly killed a man. "I'm okay," Takoda said, catching one of those huge hands in both of his own, holding it still. "I'm okay because of you. You saved my life again. And I don't know how to thank you for that, except to say that what I told Morrison was true. You're not a monster. You're the best friend I've ever had, and I—" His voice cracked and he had to stop, had to swallow past the lump in his throat because the emotion was too big for words, too complicated to express in either Apache or the gesture language they had developed, encompassing gratitude and fear and affection, and the terrible knowledge that their peaceful isolation had just been shattered beyond repair. Neshoba made a soft sound and pulled Takoda into an embrace, and the Apache warrior buried his face against the giant's chest and tried not to think about what came next, tried not to acknowledge that Morrison would bring others, that their time in the valley was now measured in days or weeks at best, that the cabin they were building together would likely never be finished. They sat together in the snow for a long time, man and giant, while the sun tracked across the sky and the half-built cabin stood silent witness to their grief. And when Takoda finally pulled back, he saw that Neshoba was bleeding from where Morrison's bullet had grazed his shoulder. The dark fur matted with blood, and guilt crashed over him because the giant had been hurt protecting him, had risked everything for someone he had only known for a few weeks. "Let me tend that," Takoda said, gesturing to the wound. And Neshoba allowed himself to be led back to the cave, where Takoda cleaned the injury with melted snow and packed it with the same moss and herbs the giant had used on his own bullet wound weeks before. And there was something deeply intimate about the role reversal, about caring for this massive being who had cared for him, about the trust implicit in Neshoba sitting still and letting Takoda work despite the pain it must have caused. "We have to finish the cabin," Takoda said as he worked, speaking his thoughts aloud even though Neshoba couldn't understand the words. "We have maybe a week, 2 at most, before Morrison comes back with reinforcements, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let you face that without having built you the home I promised. We'll work every hour of daylight, we'll push ourselves harder than we have been, and we'll make it beautiful, make it strong. Make it a testament to the fact that you existed, that you mattered, that someone cared enough to build you something permanent." Neshoba rumbled in his chest, that sound of contentment, and touched Takoda's face with one careful finger, a gesture that had become his way of expressing affection. And Takoda leaned into the touch because physical contact had become their primary language. More eloquent than words could ever be. They worked like possessed things over the following days, starting before dawn and continuing until darkness made it impossible to see. And the cabin began to take real shape under their combined efforts, walls rising log by log, notched and fitted with a precision that would have made Takoda's father proud. The roof frame beginning to arch overhead, promising shelter from the elements. Windows placed to catch the morning sun and the view of the stream. Neshoba proved to have an artistic eye that Takoda hadn't expected, suggesting changes to the design through gestures and demonstrations that improved both the structure's strength and its beauty. And Takoda realized that the giant must have spent decades watching, learning, absorbing everything he could about how things were built, even though he'd had no one to teach him, no community to share knowledge with. They carved designs into the support beams together, Takoda showing Neshoba how to use the tools and then watching in amazement as the giant created intricate patterns that mixed Apache symbols Takoda had drawn for him with what must have been designs from his own lost people, creating something entirely new, a visual language that belonged to both of them. On the fifth day after Morrison's attack, as they were laying the final logs for the roof, Neshoba suddenly stopped working and made an urgent sound, pointing toward the valley entrance. And Takoda's heart sank because he knew what that meant. The soldiers were returning. Morrison had kept his word about bringing reinforcements, and their time had run out. "How many?" Takoda asked, and Neshoba held up both hands. Fingers spread, then one hand again, then made a gesture that clearly meant more, many more. And Takoda felt ice settle in his stomach, because 15 or 20 soldiers with rifles against one giant and one Apache with limited ammunition was a fight they couldn't win. Not even with Neshoba's strength, not when the soldiers would spread out and fire from multiple angles. "We could run," Takoda said, already knowing what Neshoba's answer would be, but having to offer it anyway. "We could leave the valley, head deeper into the mountains, find another place to hide." But Neshoba was already shaking his massive head, already moving toward the cabin they had spent so many hours building. And he placed one hand flat against the logs they had fitted together with such care, and the gesture was clear. "This is home now. This is worth defending. I will not run anymore." Takoda understood because he felt the same pull, the same desperate need to protect this place they had created together. This physical manifestation of their friendship, this proof that something beautiful could be built even in the ruins of two shattered lives. "Then we make our stand here," Takoda said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. And he checked his rifle, counted his remaining ammunition, and knew it wouldn't be enough, but also knew that some things were worth dying for. That protecting Neshoba and this valley had become one of those things. The giant made a sound of agreement, but then he did something unexpected. He knelt down so his eyes were level with Takoda's, and he placed both massive hands on the Apache warrior's shoulders. And his expression was more serious than Takoda had ever seen it, filled with an intensity that made Takoda's breath catch. Neshoba gestured frantically, pointing to Takoda, then to the forest behind the cave, then making shooing motions. And the meaning was devastatingly clear. "You should go. You should save yourself." "This isn't your fight." "Like hell it isn't," Takoda said fiercely, grabbing handfuls of Neshoba's fur and pulling himself closer so their foreheads were almost touching. "You saved my life when you had every reason to let me die. You gave me purpose when I had nothing left to live for. You became family when I thought I would never have family again. If you think I'm going to abandon you now, then you don't know me at all. My friend." Neshoba's eyes were wet, actually wet with tears that Takoda hadn't known the giant could cry. And he made a sound that was pure anguish, that clearly meant, "I don't want you to die for me." And Takoda smiled even though his own eyes were burning. "Then we better make sure neither of us dies," he said. "We better be smart, be strategic, and be willing to do whatever it takes to survive this. Because I made you a promise about finishing this cabin, and I always keep my promises." They had perhaps an hour before the soldiers would arrive, and they used it to prepare, with Takoda showing Neshoba how to create obstacles and defensive positions using fallen trees and boulders, creating choke points where the soldiers would have to bunch up and expose themselves, while also leaving escape routes if the battle turned against them. Neshoba proved to have tactical instincts that suggested his people had once been warriors, had once fought and strategized and protected their own, and together they created a defensive perimeter around the cabin that would force any attackers to fight on their terms. As they worked, Takoda found himself memorizing details, the way the winter sun caught the silver in Neshoba's fur, the concentration on the giant's face as he positioned a massive boulder, the surprising gentleness with which those huge hands could place small stones to create stable positions. And he thought that if these were to be his last hours, there were worse ways to spend them than building something with the best friend he had ever known. The soldiers came as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful if they hadn't heralded violence. And Takoda counted 23 men on horseback, all armed, all wearing the blue uniforms of the United States Army, with Morrison riding near the front, his damaged eye covered by a crude bandage that only seemed to emphasize his desire for revenge. They stopped at the valley entrance, clearly wary after Morrison's previous encounter, and Takoda could see them pointing at the cabin, at the defensive positions he and Neshoba had created, probably wondering what kind of trap they were riding into. And he used their hesitation to check his rifle one final time, to say a silent prayer to the spirits of his ancestors, and to look over at Neshoba, crouched behind a boulder 20 feet away, the giant's eyes reflecting the dying light, with an intelligence and determination that made Takoda's throat tight with emotion. Morrison's voice carried across the snow, amplified by a speaking trumpet he must have brought specifically for this purpose. And the words were meant to sound official and reasonable, but couldn't quite hide the underlying cruelty. Apache in the valley, you are surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender yourself and the creature you're harboring, and you will be given a fair trial for your crimes. Resist, and we will be forced to use lethal force to bring you to justice. It was theater. Performance for the benefit of Morrison's men, who probably didn't know the truth about what had happened here, who had been fed lies about savage Indians and dangerous beasts, who saw themselves as heroes bringing civilization to the wilderness rather than murderers hunting down someone who only wanted to be left alone. Takoda felt anger build in his chest, hot and righteous, because these men had already taken everything from him once, had already destroyed his world, and now they wanted to take the small piece of peace he had managed to rebuild from the ashes. "There's no Apache here," Takoda shouted back in English, his voice strong and clear. "There's just a man trying to build a home, trying to survive the winter, trying to live in peace on land that doesn't belong to you or anyone else. Leave now, and no one has to die today." He saw Morrison lean over and say something to the officer beside him, saw them both laugh, and knew his words had fallen on ears that had no intention of listening, that had perhaps never learned how to listen to anyone who didn't look like them, or speak like them, or believe the same things they believed. The officer, a captain based on his insignia, raised his hand, and half the soldiers dismounted and began to spread out in a practiced formation that spoke of military training and experience. And Takoda realized these weren't just random soldiers, but a unit that had fought together, that knew how to coordinate their attacks, that would be far more dangerous than Morrison's small group had been. "When I signal, you run for the trees," Takoda said quietly to Neshoba in Apache, knowing the giant wouldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey the urgency. "You're too big a target. Too easy to hit if you stay in the open. Let them come to us, let them get close, and then we'll show them what it means to threaten our home." Neshoba made a negative sound, clearly understanding at least the part about running, and he gestured to himself, and they traveled in silence for the first several hours. Following the path Kohana had taken, reading signs in the disturbed earth and broken branches, moving with the practiced stealth that came from years of living in a world where being seen meant being hunted. And Neshoba marveled at Takala's skill, at how the Apache man moved through the forest like he was part of it, leaving almost no trace of his passage, his senses attuned to details that Neshoba's size would have caused him to miss. They found evidence of Kohana's passage, a cold campfire perhaps 3 months old, discarded rabbit bones that suggested he had been eating regularly, marks on trees that might have been deliberate blazes to help him find his way back, and each small sign brought both relief and renewed anxiety, because yes, Kohana had made it this far, but that told them nothing about what had happened since. On the 3rd day of their search, they encountered other Apache, a small group of refugees fleeing eastward, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear, and when Takala hailed them in their shared language and asked if they had seen a young man traveling alone, the eldest woman's eyes lit with recognition. "Yes," she said, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "We met him perhaps 6 weeks ago, a brave young man with kind eyes who shared his food with us, even though he had little to spare, who told us about a hidden valley where we would find sanctuary. He was heading toward the old gathering grounds, near the 3 rivers. Said he had heard there were Apache families there who needed help, who were trying to decide whether to surrender to the reservation or flee deeper into the mountains." Neshoba felt hope flare in his chest like a struck match, bright and fragile and desperately needed. And he knelt down so he was closer to the woman's eye level, trying to make himself less intimidating, trying to encourage her to share whatever else she knew. "Was he well when you saw him?" he asked in careful Apache, and the woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes moving over his massive form with curiosity rather than fear, as if Kohana's description of the giant who protected his valley had prepared her for this encounter. "He was well enough. Tired, worried about what he would find, but determined, so determined to help our people, to offer them hope, when hope seemed like a luxury we could no longer afford. He spoke of you," she added, her weathered face softening with something like understanding. "Spoke of the giant who had taught him that strength was for protecting rather than destroying. That family was built through choice rather than blood. That the world still held beauty if you were brave enough to look for it. They gave the refugees directions to the valley, sent them eastward with Neshoba's promise that they would find welcome there, that the community would care for them, that sanctuary still existed even in a world determined to destroy it. And then they continued their own journey westward toward the 3 rivers gathering grounds, moving faster now that they had a concrete destination, allowing hope to fuel them through exhaustion and cold and the grinding anxiety that came from not knowing, from being forced to imagine rather than confirm. The landscape changed as they traveled, becoming more rugged and mountainous, the paths harder to navigate, the evidence of human presence increasing in disturbing ways, burned areas that had clearly been Apache camps, discarded belongings that suggested people fleeing in panic, the occasional grave marker that spoke of violence and loss and grief identical to their own. They found the gathering grounds on the 7th day of their search, and Neshoba's heart sank because the place was empty, abandoned, showing signs of recent occupation but no current presence. Just the ghostly remnants of a community that had been and was no more, cold fire pits and trampled earth, a few forgotten items too damaged or worthless to carry. The lingering scent of fear and smoke and desperation. Takala moved through the camp with increasing agitation, searching for some sign of his son, some indication of where the people had gone. And when he finally stopped in the center of the empty space, his shoulders slumped with defeat, with the horrible possibility that they had come all this way only to find nothing, to learn nothing, to be left with questions but no answers. "Here," Neshoba called out, his voice sharp with discovery, and Takoda rushed over to where the giant was kneeling beside what looked like a message carved into the bark of a large pine tree. The marks recent enough that sap still oozed from the cuts, and the words were in Apache and clearly meant for anyone who came searching. Soldiers came. Communities scattered. Some went to reservations, some fled south, some captured. I follow the captured ones, K. Takoda traced the carved letter with trembling fingers, and when he looked up at Neshoba, his face held a mixture of pride and terror, because Kohana had done exactly what they should have expected, had chosen to help those in the most danger, had put himself at risk to potentially save others, had become exactly the kind of person they had raised him to be, even though that nobility might cost him everything. He went after the captured ones, Takoda said, his voice barely above a whisper. My son, my brave, foolish, wonderful son, went after people being taken by soldiers, probably followed them to wherever they were being held, probably tried to figure out a way to free them, and he stopped, unable to continue, unable to voice the terrible scenarios that logic suggested. The likelihood that one 16-year-old boy, no matter how brave or skilled, could not stand against trained soldiers, could not rescue captives from armed men, could not survive that kind of confrontation. Neshoba stood and placed both hands on Takoda's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes, willing strength and determination into the other man, because they could not afford to collapse now, could not afford to give in to despair when Kohana needed them most. Then we follow him, Neshoba said firmly. We find the soldiers, we find the captives, we find your son, and we bring them all home, because that is what he would do for us. That is what family means. That is the promise I made to his mother, and to Takoda's memory, and to myself. We do not give up, Takoda. We do not surrender to fear or to the statistics that say this should be impossible. We find him, and we bring him home. They picked up the trail that afternoon, the marks of many people moving together under guard, soldiers on horseback surrounding Apache prisoners on foot, heading northeast toward where Takoda said the nearest military outpost was located, perhaps 3 days' journey at the pace prisoners would be forced to maintain. The tracks were perhaps 2 weeks old, maybe less, which meant Kohana had a significant head start on them, meant he had been following dangerous men through dangerous territory for at least that long, meant every day that passed increased the chances that something terrible had already happened, that they were already too late. But they pushed forward anyway, sleeping in brief snatches and moving as fast as stealth would allow, following a trail that told an increasingly grim story, blood on rocks that suggested beatings, abandoned possessions that indicated prisoners shedding weight they could no longer carry, graves that were too shallow and too numerous, markers of a journey defined by cruelty and suffering. On the 9th day of their search, as they crested a ridge that overlooked a valley where smoke from cooking fires indicated human settlement, they finally saw what they had been seeking and what they had been dreading, a military outpost with crude buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade. And outside that palisade, in an area that could only generously be called a holding pen, dozens of Apache people huddled against the cold, their faces empty of hope, their movements listless with defeat and despair. Neshoba scanned the captives desperately, searching for one particular young face, and for several agonizing minutes he saw no sign of Kohana, saw only strangers suffering. And he felt his heart begin to crack, because maybe they truly were too late. Maybe the boy had tried something heroic and stupid and had paid for that courage with his life. But then Takoda gripped his arm so hard it hurt, despite the giant's thick fur, and he pointed toward a figure separate from the main group of prisoners, a young man held in what looked like a punishment cage, barely large enough to contain a human body, his wrists bound to the bars above his head, his body showing signs of beatings and exposure, but unmistakably, heartbreakingly, wonderfully alive. Kohana, bruised and battered and clearly suffering but breathing, existing, capable of being saved if they could only figure out how to reach him, without getting themselves or him killed in them. The rescue plan they devised was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Wait until deep night when most soldiers slept. Use Neshoba's strength to create a diversion on the far side of the outpost, while Takoda slipped in to free Kohana and as many other prisoners as possible, then disappear into the forest before the confused soldiers could organize an effective pursuit. It was dangerous and relied heavily on timing and luck, but it was also their only realistic option because a direct assault would get them all killed. And abandoning Kohana was not something either of them could contemplate even for a heartbeat. They spent the remaining daylight hours observing the outpost's routines, counting soldiers and noting guard rotations, identifying weak points in the palisade, and planning escape routes through the surrounding terrain. And with each passing hour, Neshoba's rage at what he saw grew hotter and more difficult to contain. The casual cruelty with which the soldiers treated their prisoners, the beatings administered for infractions as minor as speaking too loudly or moving too slowly, the inadequate food and shelter provided to people already weakened by their forced march, and worst of all, the periodic visits soldiers made to Kohana's cage specifically, taunting him, striking him, clearly punishing him more severely than the other prisoners, for some offense that had earned their particular hatred, as darkness fell and stars emerged in a sky so clear it seemed to mock the ugliness happening beneath it. Neshoba and Takoda moved into position, the giants circling wide to approach the outpost from the north, while the Apache man positioned himself near the prisoner pen on the south side, both of them waiting for the signal they had agreed upon, 3 owl calls in quick succession. A sound common enough not to alarm the guards, but distinctive enough for Takoda to recognize. The hours until midnight crawled past with agonizing slowness, and Neshoba used the time to gather materials for his diversion, dry brush and deadfall wood that would burn hot and fast, stones he could throw with enough force to damage structures, anything that would create chaos and draw attention away from where Takoda would be working to free the prisoners. At midnight, exactly, when the guard rotation had just changed and the new sentries were still settling into their positions, still adjusting to the darkness and the cold, Neshoba gave the signal, 3 perfect owl calls that carried across the still night air, and then he set fire to the pile of brush he had assembled near the northern palisade wall and began to roar, a sound so massive and primal that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. A sound calculated to inspire terror rather than curiosity, to make soldiers think about monsters and demons rather than rational threats they could fight. The response was immediate and gratifying, shouts of alarm, soldiers scrambling from their bunks, rifles being grabbed, chaos spreading through the outpost like wildfire, and most importantly, guards abandoning their posts to investigate the disturbance. To face whatever nightmare was attacking from the north, Neshoba threw stones with terrible accuracy, shattering windows and punching holes through wooden walls, keeping the soldiers focused on him, giving Takoda the time and distraction he needed. And the giant felt a savage satisfaction watching these men, who had brutalized prisoners, scramble in panic, watching their arrogance dissolve into fear, watching them realize that for once they were not the most dangerous thing in the darkness. He retreated slowly, deliberately, staying visible enough to keep their attention, but never close enough for their bullets to find him, leading them away from the prisoner pen, drawing them into the forest where his size and strength would be advantages rather than liabilities. And he could hear their confused shouts, their frightened calls to each other, their growing panic as they realized they were chasing something they could not understand or categorize. Meanwhile, on the south side of the outpost, Takoda worked with desperate speed and practiced stealth, using a knife to cut through the ropes that bound the prisoners, whispering urgent instructions in Apache for them to move quietly toward the tree line, to scatter once they reached cover, to run and not stop running until they were miles away from this place of suffering. Most of the prisoners needed no encouragement, disappearing into the darkness like smoke, but some were too weak to move quickly, too beaten down to believe escape was possible, and Takoda had to physically support them, had to half-carry them toward freedom while constantly watching for guards who might notice what was happening. He saved Kohana for last, approaching the punishment cage where his son hung from bound wrists. And when the boy's swollen eyes opened and focused on his father's face, the expression of disbelief followed by overwhelming relief, followed by tears, was almost more than Takoda could bear. "Papa," Kohana whispered, his voice raw from screaming during the beatings, from calling out warnings to other prisoners, from refusing to give the soldiers the satisfaction of his silence. You actually came, I thought. I thought I would die here. Thought I would never see home again, never see you or Mama or—" His voice broke as Takoda cut through the ropes binding him and caught him as he collapsed, his legs too weak to support his weight after days of being suspended. "Neshoba is here too," Takoda whispered urgently, supporting his son's weight, beginning to move them both toward the tree line. "He is creating a diversion, drawing the soldiers away, but we must move now, must get you to safety before they realize what has happened." The reunion happened in the forest, an hour later, after they had put significant distance between themselves and the outpost, after the sounds of confused soldiers had faded into the background, after Takoda had set a pace that Kohana could barely maintain, but somehow managed through sheer determination and the desperate desire to survive after coming so close to death. Neshoba emerged from the shadows like a materializing dream, and when Kohana saw him, the young man's face crumpled completely, all his carefully maintained courage dissolving, and he stumbled forward into the giant's arms and sobbed with a brokenness that spoke of trauma endured and barely survived, of faith tested and nearly shattered, of relief so profound it hurt more than the beatings had. "I tried to save them," Kohana gasped between sobs, his words tumbling out in a rush, as if confession could somehow absolve the guilt he carried. "The soldiers came and people scattered and some were captured, and I followed them thinking maybe I could help, maybe I could find a way to free them. But I was caught trying to sneak into their camp, and they beat me and caged me, and I failed. I failed everyone. I could not save them, and I almost died for nothing." Neshoba made soothing sounds and held the boy closer, feeling the tremors running through his battered body, feeling rage at those who had hurt him, warring with overwhelming relief that he was alive, that they had found him in time, that this story would not end with another grave beside Takoda's. "You did not fail," Neshoba said firmly, pulling back enough to look directly into Kohana's swollen eyes, needing him to hear this, to believe it, to understand that courage was not measured by outcomes, but by the willingness to try. "You followed people who needed help even though it was dangerous. You tried to save them even though you were alone. You endured torture rather than revealing information about the valley that would have put everyone at risk. That is not failure, Kohana. That is heroism. That is exactly what I would have hoped you would do, what I am proud beyond words that you did. And we saved many tonight," he added, gesturing to the darkness where freed prisoners were scattered and running toward whatever safety they could find. "Because you marked their location, because you gave us a trail to follow, because your courage brought us here at the right time to do something meaningful. You made that possible. My son." The word hung in the air between them. Son, a word Neshoba had never spoken to Kohana before, a claim he had never made explicit, even though it had been true in his heart for years. And the young man's eyes went wide with wonder and fresh tears, and he pressed his face against Neshoba's chest and whispered, "I love you. I love you so much, and I was so afraid I would never see you again, never get to tell you what you mean to me, how you saved me in ways that had nothing to do with physical rescue, how you taught me what it means to be good in a world that rewards cruelty." And Neshoba held him and rocked him like the child he had been when they first met. and he felt something settle in his chest that had been restless and uncertain for centuries, the knowledge that he had found his purpose, that protecting and teaching and loving this young man and others like him was what he had been surviving for, what all the loneliness and loss had been preparing him to do. They traveled slowly on the return journey because Kahana's injuries made speed impossible, and Neshoba carried him much of the way, cradling the young man against his chest the way he had carried Takoda all those years ago. And the parallel was not lost on him, how he had started this journey carrying a dying man and was ending it carrying a living one, how loss had given way to recovery, how death had been transformed into life. They took twice as long to reach the valley as they had taken to leave it, moving carefully to avoid pursuit, stopping frequently to tend Kahana's wounds and allow him to rest. And during those quiet moments, the young man talked about what he had seen, about Apache communities being systematically destroyed, about families being torn apart and forced onto reservations where disease and despair killed as effectively as bullets, about the desperate need for sanctuaries like their valley where culture and dignity could be preserved, where children could grow up knowing their heritage rather than having it beaten out of them. "We need to do more," Kahana said one evening as they sat around a small fire, his voice gaining strength as his body slowly healed. "The valley can hold more people, can support a larger community if we are smart about resource management and construction, and there are so many who need help, so many who are fleeing with nowhere to go. I want to make our valley a true refuge, Neshoba. Not just a hidden place, but a preserve for our culture, a place where Apache traditions can be maintained and passed to future generations, where we can prove that we are more than what the soldiers say we are, more than savages to be eliminated or civilized." Neshoba listened with pride swelling in his chest, because this was leadership emerging, this was vision being born from trauma, this was exactly the kind of transformation that made suffering meaningful rather than merely cruel. They crested the final ridge overlooking the valley on a morning 3 weeks after they had left, and the sight that greeted them was so beautiful it made Neshoba's eyes burn with tears. The cabins scattered through the meadow, with smoke rising from their chimneys. Children playing in the snow despite the cold. Adults going about their daily work with the casual confidence of people who felt safe. And at the center of it all, the original cabin he and Takoda had built together. Still standing, still solid, still the foundation on which everything else had been constructed. A child spotted them first and raised the alarm. And suddenly, the entire community was pouring out of buildings and running toward them. And Muna reached them first, her face transformed by joy and relief. And she pulled Kahana from Neshoba's arms and held him while she wept and thanked the spirits and cursed him for worrying her and promised to never let him out of her sight again. And Takala wrapped his arms around both of them, and they stood together as a family reunited, while the rest of the community gathered around, offering blessings and welcome. That evening, as the community celebrated with a feast that felt like a festival, with food being shared and stories being told and songs being sung that mixed Apache traditions with the wordless vocalizations of Neshoba's people, the giant slipped away to visit Takoda's grave, and he knelt in the snow and placed his hand on the familiar stones and spoke with a heart so full it felt like it might burst. "We found him," Neshoba said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "We brought him home, we saved him, we did what you would have done if you were here. And I understand now, my brother, I understand why you died to protect me, why you threw yourself between that bullet and my heart. Because I would have done the same for Kahana, would do the same for any of them. Because love makes cowards into heroes. Because protecting those we care about is the only thing that truly matters. Because family, chosen family, built family, family of the heart is worth any sacrifice." He sat in silence for a while, feeling the cold seep through his fur, hearing the distant sounds of celebration. And he thought about the journey that had brought him here, from isolation to community, from monster to family member, from merely surviving to actually living. And all of it had started with one dying Apache warrior who had seen past appearance to essence, who had offered friendship to something that shouldn't exist, who had taught him that walls between different kinds of souls were illusions that could be dismantled through simple acts of kindness and courage. "Thank you," Neshoba whispered to the grave, to the memory, to the spirit he believed was listening. "Thank you for finding me, for saving me, for building that first cabin with me that became the foundation for all of this. You live on in every log I place, in every person I protect, in every moment of joy and connection and love that fills this valley. You live on through me and through Kohana and through everyone whose life has been touched by the ripples of your kindness. Rest well, my friend, my brother. Your sacrifice was not in vain." A sound made him turn, and he found Kohana standing nearby, still bruised and battered, but standing on his own, his eyes clear and focused. And the young man came to kneel beside Neshoba at the grave, and they sat together in comfortable silence until Kohana spoke quietly. "Neshoba told me about you," he said, addressing the grave as if Takoda could hear him. "Told me how you saved him, how you saw the person beneath the legend, how you died protecting him, and in doing so gave him back his life. I never met you, but I carry your legacy. Neshoba became the person he is because of you, and I became the person I am because of him. And that chain of love and teaching and protection started with your choice to offer friendship to someone who expected only fear. Thank you for that. Thank you for making this all possible." They returned to the celebration together, and Neshoba stood at the edge of the gathering, watching his community, his family, and he felt Kohana's hand slip into his, felt the young man lean against his side, and he looked around at all the faces illuminated by firelight, at the children who saw him as protector rather than monster, at the adults who treated him as brother rather than beast, at the life that had blossomed from the seeds Takoda had planted with his sacrifice, and he understood finally, completely, that this was happiness, that this was purpose, that this was what it meant to be alive rather than merely existing. The scars remained, would always remain, but they had become part of a larger story, a story about transformation and redemption, about choosing love over hatred, about building beauty from the ruins of loss. Years would pass, and Kohana would become a leader in his own right, would guide the community with wisdom learned from both his father and his giant mentor, would expand the valley's reach to save countless Apache families fleeing violence and forced relocation. More cabins would be built, more children would be born and raised, knowing safety and dignity. More stories would be told around fires about the giant who protected them, and the Apache warrior who had first taught him that protection was more powerful than isolation. And through it all, Neshoba would stand watch, would teach and build and love, would visit Takoda's grave every evening without fail, to report on the day's events, to share victories and struggles, to maintain the connection with the friend whose death had somehow, impossibly, led to more life than either of them could have imagined. On the evening of Kohana's 18th birthday, as the young man prepared to take on full adult responsibilities in the community, Neshoba presented him with a gift, a carved beam for his own cabin, covered in symbols that told the story of their relationship. From the frightened child who had arrived seeking safety to the confident young man who now helped provide that safety to others. And at the center of the carving were three figures, a giant, an Apache warrior, and a young man, all standing together, all equal, all family. Kohana traced the carving with trembling fingers, and when he looked up at Neshoba, his eyes were shining with tears and love and understanding. "This is who we are," Kohana said softly. "This is what Takoda started, what you built, what we will pass on to the next generation and the next, proof that family is not about blood or species or anything except the choice to love and protect and stand together against everything that would tear us apart. Thank you, Father, for teaching me that. Thank you for saving me in every way a person can be saved. Thank you for being exactly who you are. And Nashoba pulled his son in every way that mattered, into an embrace. And he looked past him to the valley they had protected together, to the community they had built together, to the future they would face together. And he sent one final thought toward Takoda's grave. I kept my promise, my brother. I built us a home, and it became a home for many, and none of us are alone anymore. Rest well, knowing that your sacrifice created something beautiful, something lasting, something worthy of the life you gave to make it possible. The stars emerged one by one above the valley, as they always did, indifferent to human joy or sorrow, marking time with their ancient patterns. And beneath their cold light, a community slept safe behind walls, built by hands both giant and human, protected by love stronger than hatred, sustained by hope that refused to die even when the world seemed determined to extinguish it. Living proof that from the ashes of loss, beauty could still bloom, that between broken souls, bridges could be built that would stand for generations.